Hello there, you Awakening Wonders. Thanks for joining me on Stay Free with Russell Brand on Rumble. If you're watching this on YouTube or anywhere else, eventually you're going to have to click the link in the description and join us over in Rumble. And if you can become a supporter, it's the only way that you can back our independent voice at a time where it's obviously being challenged. We've got a great show for you today. In our item, Here's the News, no, here's the effing news, we are going to be talking about the state and the legacy media's war on free speech, and in particular, how that has affected me this week. We've also got Jimmy Dore coming up on the show, and you know what Jimmy Dore will be advocating for: revolution, mass disobedience, new alliances between ordinary people, putting aside the barriers and boundaries of left and right, that we can come together to oppose increasingly authoritarian, centralised power. We're going to continue to do on this channel what we've always done: tell you the truth as best we can, listen to you as best we can. So the first story we're going to talk about is Stoltenberg acknowledging that Putin invaded Ukraine due to NATO infringement. A significant story because, of course, what we've mostly been schooled in is that Russia are a criminal nation led by a lunatic in Putin that unprovoked attacked Ukraine. As we always say, the Ukrainian people should be utmost in our thoughts, and the humanitarian imperatives that the world claims are what's driving this war ought be what's driving a move towards peace. But as you know, the military-industrial complex are significantly invested in what some people, Jimmy Dore notably, regard as a money laundering operation. Let's have a look at Stoltenberg acknowledging the simple truth that Putin was provoked.
President Putin declared in the autumn of 2021, and he actually sent a draft treaty that he wanted NATO to sign, to promise no more NATO enlargement. That was what he sent us. And that was a precondition for not invade Ukraine. Of course, we didn't sign that. The opposite happened. He wanted us to sign a promise never to enlarge NATO. He wanted us to remove our military infrastructure in all allies that have joined NATO since 1997, meaning half of NATO, all the Central and Eastern Europe. We should remove NATO from that part of our alliance, introducing some kind of E and B or second-class membership. We rejected that. So he went to war to prevent more NATO close to his borders. He has got the exact opposite.
In a sense, what's being described there is the recipe for a peaceful resolution to this conflict, which many believe. And let me know what you think in the chat. And remember, if you press the red awaken button, you can join our community, and it's more important that you do that now than it ever has been before. Join our locals community. We need your support. We are plainly in a position where your direct support is going to be incredibly valuable to us. Now, what we've just heard there described is the reasons that Putin went to war with Ukraine. Let's get into this story a little more deeply. Jesse Stoltenberg asserted today that weakening Russia in Ukraine could allow the United States to intensify its efforts in countering China. Stoltenberg and chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Mark Milley, believe the war in Ukraine will continue for years if Kiev is to achieve its military goals. Stoltenberg said, "We must prepare ourselves for a long war in Ukraine." Who would benefit from a long war in Ukraine? Would it be the Ukrainian people, or would it be the military-industrial complex? Why don't you let us know in the chat what you think? President Biden met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on Thursday and announced a new tranche of US military aid for Ukraine that includes more cluster bombs, which are notorious for killing and maiming civilians. It seems that there's an absolute amorality when it comes to the approach of this war, when it comes to telling stories about this war, when it comes to dissenting against this war, when it comes to advocating for peace, when it comes to looking at what conditions may have led to this war. In a minute, we're going to have our presentation, Here's the News, no, here's the effing news, where I'm going to be talking about how the state, legacy media and big tech cooperate with one another in order to control narratives that are plainly against the interests of ordinary people, how they prevent us from becoming united around topics as diverse as the pandemic and indeed this ongoing conflict, and also how the same PSYOPs units that used to be engaged in opposition against ISIS are now being deployed against domestic populations. We'll be talking about that in a matter of moments. Also, we'll be talking to Jimmy Dore. But I think it's important that we cover these vital issues that appear to have considerable opposition from the mainstream legacy media. We're talking about what we've always talked about. Big Pharma and their ability to assert and exert power over political process. The military-industrial complex that seem to be able to control foreign policy, to create war, and then find convenient excuses for why that war might be taking place. Most of all, what we're advocating for is our shared collective voices and our ability to independently communicate with one another. For the possibility that we might create new systems together. If we don't have the ability to control currency, if we don't have the ability to create independent media, then we are slowly being corralled into a totalitarian space where nobody has any individual power. We already live in a globalist, corporatist condition where unelected bodies, whether that's NATO, no one voted for them, the WHO, no one voted for them, or the UN, are in a position where they are able to impose policy on sovereign nations. Democracy is becoming meaningless. And the only reason those stories are not being told is because legacy media are in lockstep with one another in order to prevent truthful, open and honest conversations happening that would allow us to form new alliances. We'll be looking at that in Here's the News. But now, without going too much more deeply into this obvious crisis and counter-narrative to how the war between Ukraine and Russia began, let's have a look at the Empire State Building being lit up as a giant Pfizer needle. For what reason exactly? This is a press release about that story. Today, the Empire State Building turned its iconic building blue to announce that the CDC recommends everyone 6 months of age and older gets this season's updated COVID-19 shot. The blue light symbolises our gratitude and appreciation for the updated vaccines and all those who made it possible. A literal monolith and icon of American culture is being turned into an advertisement for a private company. When did the symbols of a great nation become co-opted by a corporation? How has this been allowed to happen? And how is it still allowed to be referred to as a democracy? Let me know in the chat. Marty Makary, Professor Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, wrote in the New York Post that Pfizer's version of the new vaccine has not been tested on humans at all. We only have data about antibody production from 10 mice. If I wasn't reading that from a reliable scientist myself, I would assume that it was untrue. How is that plausible and feasible that a national cause, an international notion, can be presented to a global population on the basis of 10 mice? The experience of 10 mice is being used to undergird an ongoing global program. For me, that's a cause for some concern. In summer 2020, as COVID vaccines moved ahead at warp speed, the companies behind them promised they wouldn't make too much money. Let's see how that went. Pfizer chairman Albert Bourla was emphatic. His company was developing a COVID vaccine for the good of humanity, not for money, he told Time magazine in 2020. This is not business as usual, he said. If you were calculating return on investment, we would never do these things. We were discussing that back in March, what that means to human lives, to the economy of the world, so it must be that we take those measures. Thus, Pfizer would not overcharge for the mRNA vaccine it was developing with the German company BioNTech, Bourla said. We're going to charge governments a very, very nominal value, he said. Asked directly if Pfizer intended to profit, Bourla said, we will make a very, very marginal profit at this stage. So, were Pfizer telling the truth? Pfizer made more than $100 billion in profits from the COVID vaccine in 2022 alone. Those facts seem to me to be significant. Those facts seem to me worthy of discussion. And I don't think we're going to see that discussed on the mainstream media. Let me know in the chat if you've noticed how the mainstream media reports on certain stories, investigating them extremely thoroughly, and elsewhere there is little or no debate or dissent. What do you think about that? What do you think is actually happening? So, whether it's the war in Ukraine and NATO's involvement in provoking it, or Pfizer's relationship with the United States of America and their ability to co-opt national symbols of pride and turn them into corporate emblems that have only been, let's face it, tested on 10 mice. It seems that the state and the media have a pretty close relationship. Let's have a look at events this week. You now know that I've been demonetized on YouTube. You're fully well aware that the government wrote to social media platforms to demand that I be further censored. Here's the news. No. Here's the effing news.
Thank you for choosing Fox News.
No, here's the fucking news.
The corporatist state and global media war against free speech is in full swing. How do I know? Take a guess. Today, of course, we're talking about events of the last week, but in particular, the collusion between big tech and government and an apparent concerted effort by legacy media and now the state and big tech to silence independent media voices. Obviously, it's difficult for me to be entirely objective given the events of the last week, but that is what we must try to do. And thankfully, we have some incredible reporting from the Grey Zone and elsewhere, as well as being able to introduce you to the concept of the Trusted News Initiative. This is a long-standing agreement between global legacy media organizations to cooperate with one another, to corroborate one another in order to shut down what they believe to be their true enemy, independent media voices. What do they mean by that? Do you think this is simply about business? Do you think that this is about clicks and revenue? Or do you think that there is something bigger at stake, something of incredible ideological significance? What do you think is the relationship between the media and the state? Do you think, looking back at the last couple of years, in particular the pandemic and the current war, that there has been support from the media when it comes to government policy and a lack of accountability and questioning when it comes to very important and significant questions? Do you think that the legacy media has been investigating the causes of this war, the origins of this war, with the kind of vigour that you might have seen elsewhere? Do you think that the legacy media has been investigating Big Pharma, the imperatives, incentives, financial undergirding of Big Pharma in the way that they have investigated other matters? Let me know in the chat, let me know in the comments, because it seems to me more important now than ever before that we have to analyse, review and understand exactly what's happening literally on a global scale between the mainstream media, the state and big tech. Let's get into it. The author of letters to social media companies demanding the financial punishment of Russell Brand is a British lawmaker implicated in London's war on COVID-19 and Ukraine dissenters. Her husband was a commander in the Army's PSYOPs division. The Grey Zone can now reveal that YouTube's financial censorship of Russell Brand is the result of an effort waged by a former British government minister who was responsible for London's crackdown on dissent during the COVID-19 pandemic. Her husband has also participated in that campaign of state repression as deputy commander of the 77th Brigade, the British Army's psychological warfare division. New developments suggest YouTube's censorship of Brand was driven by direct British government decree. On September the 19th, the social media companies TikTok and Rumble received a pair of almost identical letters dispatched from Caroline Dinenage, the head of the UK Parliament's Culture, Media and Sports Committee. Dinenage informed the companies she was concerned that Brand may be able to profit from his content published on both platforms. She then suggested they impose financial penalties. In a sense, the bypass of judicial process, right to punitive measures, financial ones, seems like an interesting stance for a government minister to be suggesting to a big tech platform. The committee's letter to Rumble contained a direct demand for demonetisation. We would like to know whether Rumble intends to join YouTube in suspending Mr. Brand's ability to earn money on the platform. In a withering response to Dinenage's letter, Rumble CEO Chris Pavlovski asserted that Rumble emphatically rejects the UK Parliament's demands. This is, of course, why we are fortunate to be on Rumble. Please join us there. Please consider supporting us so that we can continue with our organisation. I'm beginning to think that our organisation is having an impact due to recent events. The CEO continued, "We regard it as deeply inappropriate and dangerous that the UK Parliament would attempt to control who is allowed to speak on our platform or earn a living from doing so." Caroline Dinenage served as the UK government's Digital and Culture Minister from February 2020 to September 2021, making her de facto chief of the Department for Culture, Media and Sports, DCMS. In this capacity, she was personally responsible for overseeing construction of the repressive World Economic Forum endorsed online safety bill, which has been criticised by rights groups for threatening the rights to free expression and privacy. For her leading role in crafting the bill, Dinenage was honoured by the Princess Royal with the title of Dame Commander of the British Empire. Moreover, during this period, the DCMS was home to the shadowy intelligence official-run Counter-Disinformation Unit, which policed COVID-19 disinformation narratives online. Investigations by the civil liberties organisation Big Brother Watch has revealed that instead of suppressing content that posed risks to public health, the CDU was preoccupied with censoring and deplatforming reasonable online criticisms of the British government's COVID-19 COVID-19 response, including opposition to lockdowns and vaccine passports. What we appear to be looking at here are a set of collaborating institutions that have an agenda and then pursue that agenda, even when in pursuing it they have to bypass, repress, obstruct or absolutely ignore existing judicial or regulatory bodies and protocols by moving straight to punitive measures, by bypassing judicial systems, and in particular in the event of COVID, of course, repressing true information, preventing healthy online debate. It's plain that there were narratives that were repressed during the COVID pandemic. It's plain during the ongoing Ukraine-Russia conflict that, well, for example, Russia Today are not allowed to be on most social media sites. Rumble continue to host Russia Today so that people are able to discern from themselves propaganda from truth. This, I feel, is an important component in any democracy. Let me know if you agree in the chat. According to an official fact sheet, the CDU's focus turned to the Ukraine war in 2022. Doesn't it seem odd to you that you can move from a health pandemic to a war? Aren't they quite distinct, compartmentalized issues? Doesn't it seem, therefore, that the real issue is not the subject themselves, a pandemic and how to handle that sensibly, or a war and how to handle that judiciously and correctly, but dissent itself? The ability to oppose existing narratives, the ability to begin to organize communities against establishment narratives and preferred systemic outcomes is being closed down, I would suggest, on the basis of this, rather aggressively. Let me know what you think. Diana's husband, Mark Lancaster, helped lead London's blitz on pandemic dissent as Deputy Commander of the British Army's 77th Brigade between June 2018 and July 2022. Specialised in behaviour and attitudinal change, which in itself seems like a strange military unit. What are we going to do about behaviour and attitudes? Mind your own business and focus on just wars? There aren't any. The 77th Brigade maintains a vast militia of real, fake and automated social media accounts to disseminate and amplify pro-state messaging and discredit domestic and foreign enemies. During the pandemic, the 77th Brigade targeted people within Britain and across the West with advanced psychological manipulation strategies honed on battlefields against enemy militaries. It seems that, in the absence of an external enemy, the domestic population becomes the enemy, and any ability to organise and communicate with the domestic population in order that they act on behalf of their own interests has to be silenced and shut down using whatever techniques are necessary and possible. It's only a short while since the pandemic ended, and who knows, maybe the pandemic will begin again. But we now know that at the beginning of the pandemic, theories and ideas were being discussed at the very highest level that were dismissed publicly. We now know that experts with legitimate voices, valid views, clinical trials, significant information were silenced, not because of your safety or my safety, but precisely because it was necessary to control them. Once these institutions exist, it becomes apparent that they can be deployed not only with a pandemic or a war, but potentially with anything that poses a threat to existing narratives. The online profile of a 77th Brigade veteran notes that they were deployed straight from a tour of the Middle East, where they successfully implemented behavioural change strategies against ISIS to countering disinformation and misinformation during the COVID-19 crisis. Doesn't it seem odd that ISIS and the COVID-19 crisis were handled by the same unit, were treated in the same way, when ISIS were the most overt, explicit, amplified enemy and threat that the world had ever faced at that time? And doesn't it seem to you as well a coincidence worth noting that at the commencement of the COVID-19 pandemic, the problem of ISIS just appeared to disintegrate entirely? I'm not suggesting any conspiratorial reason for this. I'm sure there are military, strategic, geopolitical, ideological and philosophical reasons for this. But the very fact that the same unit that was used to confront and counter ISIS is used to confront and counter you strikes me as worthy of consideration and contemplation. Let me know what you think. However, in January, an ex-brigade whistleblower revealed how the Ministry of Defence and RRU routinely circumvented British law to advance the government's crusade against pandemic dissent. It appears there are financial ties between Google and the person that wrote that letter. It's worth noting too that Google is a competitor to Rumble, a significant competitor, a near monopolist. How do media organisations cooperate with one another when it comes to presenting a news narrative? You will remember perhaps in particular the Joe Rogan horse medicine moment. You will recall how you saw a spate of comparable headlines from around the world using the same wording. You will perhaps recall that you never once heard, hold on a second, this is a Nobel Prize prize-winning medicine, the inventor of which literally has a statue outside of medical organisations. A revered and significant medicine was simultaneously referred to as horse paste around the world. How does something like that happen? How does the media operate in coordination and lockstep to present a narrative that appears to be impenetrable, so immersive and absolute that it simply must be true? Well, apparently there's an organisation called the Trusted News Initiatives. We've said many times on our channel that when you have a word like trusted in the name of an organisation, it's worth questioning whether or not you can trust them. Let's find out what the Trusted News Initiative is. In short, I can tell you that it's a collaboration between legacy media and big tech sites in order to prevent independent media voices communicating. How effective could that be? Is it possible to shut down independent media? What strategies would be deployed? How would they work together? Surely the BBC and CNN and the New York Times and various other organisations, online ones like Facebook, would have a vested interest in competing with one another. Is that true? Let's find out. In January, the chairman of the Children's Health Defence, Robert Kennedy, and other plaintiffs filed a lawsuit against the Trusted News Initiative alleging antitrust and First Amendment violations. Trusted News Initiative, launched in March 2020, is a coalition of some of the world's largest news organisations, including the Associated Press, the BBC, the Washington Post and Reuters, who partnered with big tech with the aim of stopping the spread of misinformation. It's just a couple of weeks to stop the spread. Kennedy, CHD, and several other organisations, journalists and individuals filed a lawsuit that these legacy news organisations partnered with big tech to collectively censor online news about COVID-19 and the 2020 presidential election that did not align with the official narratives. The result was a significant loss in visibility and revenue. It appears that apparently independent, or at least separate, news organisations are collaborating, and I hesitate to use this word, conspiring to control global news narratives in some of the most important stories in the world. Why? Well, let's explain to you that their intention, it appears, and this is explicit, and we have a quote that undergirds this claim, the explicit intention is to shut down independent media voices. The lawsuit notes that there are two categories of TNI members: legacy news organisations and big tech platforms. You will remember that there was a time where on certain platforms, for example YouTube, where we are now significantly demonetised, you used to have the sense that independent news organisations could flourish, could burgeon, could come up, could establish an audience precisely because they would report in a different way to the mainstream news media. Over time, it's become clear that whether it's on the left or the right, when it comes to significant issues, mainstream media and legacy media organisations report in the same way. I'm talking, for example, about the pandemic or about war, important defining issues. Initially, there was a point where online platforms housed independent media in a favourable way, but something appeared to change. It appears that big tech platforms and legacy media started to operate in alignment with one another. Well, why would that be? And is there any paper trail for how that happened and why that would happen? The TNI exists to, in its own words, choke off and stamp out online news reporting that the Trusted News Initiative or any of its members peremptorily deems misinformation, the lawsuit states. Choke off and stamp out independent news voices. Let me know what you think in the comments. TNI members have targeted and suppressed completely accurate online reporting by non-mainstream news publishers concerning both COVID-19 on matters including treatments, immunity, lab leak, vax injury, and lockdowns and lockdown mandates, and US elections, such as the Hunter Biden laptop story. It adds, by their own admission, members of the TNI have agreed to work together and have in fact worked together to exclude from the world's dominant internet platforms rival news publishers who engage in reporting that challenges and competes with TNI members, reporting on certain issues relating to COVID-19 and US politics. My objectivity has been strongly challenged over recent weeks, but I recognise that I am an insignificant individual in the scheme of things. What is incredibly important is independent media. What is incredibly important is the ability to hold the establishment to account. What is incredibly important is that you have independent media that doesn't just accept government narratives, but investigates, challenges mainstream legacy media narratives and government narratives. For example, a group like the Grey Zone. It doesn't even matter where politically they might lie, on the left or the right. This is becoming increasingly irrelevant because what we are seeing is the rise of centralized centralization and authoritarianism, a desire to censor, to surveil, to control, to shut down dissent, and to deprive people of the option of meaningful political alternatives. What we are being given is a homogenized media space that literally has an accord to agree with one another and to defy, shut down, oppress, choke out, stamp on independent media voices. Why is that? Well, one might imagine is because they are in absolute alignment with centralist state and globalist elite dictates, and they simply don't want opposing voices out there. Because if there are opposing voices out there, then we have an alternative. We have an alternative view. We have the ability to oppose their agenda. Once independent voices are stamped out, then all you have are legacy media outlets who already agree with one another and already agree with the corporatist state. That means there will be no opposition. There will be no dissent. While the Trusted News Initiative publicly purports to be a self-appointed truth police, and that's not really the way to appoint police, is it? Who should be the police? Me? Extirpating online misinformation, in fact, it has suppressed wholly accurate and legitimate reporting in furtherance of the economic self-interest of its members. Economic self-interest of its members. Closing down truthful conversation, legitimate data in order to pursue economic interests. I believe it goes beyond even economic interests. I believe this is about ideology and the ability to oppose ideology. I believe this is about freedom. I believe this is about real democracy. Because for there to be real democracy, there has to be dissent. There has to be open communication. There has to be the ability to challenge mainstream media narratives. You can't have a media that is in lockstep with itself, immersively attacking on subjects like the war, COVID-19 and how to handle it, and a host of other issues. Here we have the evidence that the mainstream media is working together to support a state agenda. Do you agree? Let me know. To support the allegation, the lawsuit cites several public statements made by TNI members. In March 2020, then senior news controller at BBC News, Jamie Angus, explained TNI's strategy to beat disinformation. Now remember, we've said for a long time, disinformation is an extraordinary new term. Disinformation, misinformation, malinformation. What is meant? Often it's information that is at odds with the agenda of the powerful. So here's that quote. Because actually the real rivalry now is not between, for example, the BBC and CNN globally. It's actually between all trusted news providers, trusted means members of this cartel, trusted news providers, and a tidal wave of unchecked reporting, uncensored reporting, that's being piped out mainly through digital platforms, independent media like this. That's the real competition now in the digital media world. Of course, organisations will always compete against one another for audiences, but the existential threat, I think, is that overall breakdown in trust, so that trusted news organisations lose in the long term if audiences just abandon the idea of a relationship of trust with news organisations. And what is happening with trust in mainstream media organisations? Well, nearly 60% of people see mainstream media as a threat to democracy, according to one poll. The UK's got the second lowest levels of trust in the press in a survey of 24 countries, only Egypt having less trust. America's trust in media remains at a new record low, and trust in media is so low that half of Americans now believe that news organisations deliberately mislead them. So if you're in America, you're already accustomed to the idea that the mainstream media deliberately misleads you. Why? Because they want to destroy independent media, because they are in alliance with centralist state and corporatist imperatives, and because they do not want dissenting and opposing voices. And remember, we showed you earlier, when it comes to the intelligence and psyops component of this, it doesn't matter whether you're a foreign combatant in the Middle East, specifically ISIS, or someone that has questions about COVID-19. You are regarded as an enemy of the centralist state and corporate media narrative, and you have to be shut down. The spokesman for the Trusted News Initiative continued. So actually, we've got a lot more to hold us together than we have to work in competition with one another. Plaintiffs are online news publishers who, as a result of the TNI's group boycott, have been censored, demonetized, demoted, throttled, shadow banned, and or excluded entirely from platforms like Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram. Explaining how TNI acts as a global media monopoly, CHD President Mary Holland said, they couch what they're doing, their conspiracy to suppress independent media, i.e. the voices of dissent about election information and COVID information, as a need to preserve the trust of the people and upgrade the trust. By censoring independent voices, what they're doing is economic suppression. Antitrust is against trusts, is against monopolies, and what the TNI has done is essentially create a global media monopoly in the English language. Plainly, this is a story that is much bigger than me. Plainly, the Trusted News Initiative narrative has an agenda, an explicit agenda to throttle and choke independent media. Plainly, the government are reaching out to ask big tech platforms to suppress the voices of content creators from independent media outlets, particularly those that are dissenting. And as you have seen, many of those media organizations have been willing to comply. It seems to me highly possible and likely that legacy media organizations and big tech platforms are collaborating in a variety of ways. Look at the reporting on geopolitical conflicts. Look at the ability of the military-industrial complex to apparently control those narratives and shut down dissent and direct public funds. Look at what happened in the pandemic period and how difficult it was to have true information and legitimate experts able to present their views. Plainly, there is something happening. We can see the legislation for it in all of the Five Eyes countries. We can see that the Trusted News Initiative is a cartel of groups with a clear agenda. They're not competing with one another. They are competing with independent media voices. And that's not because the independent media voices themselves are important. There are thousands of them. That's what is significant. That is what is powerful. What is truly important is the ability for dissent, your dissent, to be expressed. The ability for those of us that disagree with this system, that disagree with centralized authoritarianism, to have the ability to communicate with one another, to have the ability to discuss these topics, to have the ability to oppose an agenda that seems to me to be about closing down individual freedom, closing down democracy, centralizing power, destroying dissent, advancing surveillance and censorship. No matter what crisis, the outcome is always the same. We have to shut down dissenting voices. And when you have PSYOP organizations that treat people that have questions about a health issue the same way that they would treat terrorists, then I think it's time to look at the way that information is being reported and the way that information is being conveyed. Stay free.
Thank you for choosing Fox News.
No, here's the fucking news.
Joining me now is Jimmy Dore, comedian, political commentator, and host of the Jimmy Dore Show. Jimmy, thank you for joining me this week.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Obviously, I now, in particular, have a new experience on the way that the media and the state can cooperate